Hello and welcome to another episode of Inflection. I am Brian Berletic. Joining me as always is Angelo Giuliano. He is in Venezuela, and the internet connection there is touch and go, so please bear with us if there's any technical difficulties. It was okay last week. We're doing this live and public. Toward the end, we want to kind of do a question and answer session. If you have a question, try to hold it until the end and put like a capital Q or write the word question in all caps, and we'll try to get to them. Today is a really big episode. We're going to be talking about the US and China and what a possible war might look like between these two countries. And the reason we're talking about this is because there is this torrent of war propaganda coming out of the West, trying to stir up animosity between their populations and China. We just saw the 60 Minutes Australia piece, absolute war propaganda. Angelo, when you saw that, what did you think?
Sorry, the connection is not very good, but yeah, I saw this piece. It was chilling. There's a chilling effect, and it's amazing just how you can see that they are preparing people for war. You know, it's from the music to the tones, and they're trying to counterbalance with some people coming over with some more like against the war, but it's not. I mean, it's pretty much 90% for war. So they're preparing the minds of people, and I think this Murdoch media is just the extreme when it comes to warmongering and manufacturing consent.
Yeah, and we've seen this before. We watched the lead up to the invasion of Iraq. We saw all the same sort of lies, all the same sort of dehumanization of the Iraqi people before. We watched feedback on your side. Invasion of Iraq. We saw all the same sort of lies, all the same sort of dehumanization of the Iraqi people before. Okay, maybe that was coming on my side, or was that coming out on your side, Angelo, the audio?
I don't know, the sound is not too good. I'm sorry, just connections here in Venezuela are really tough, sorry.
That's okay. It's live, and we'll just work through it. And actually, Venezuela is going to play into this. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go right into this. We've kind of broken this down into parts. So first, I want to show people that the U.S. engineering a war with China is not hypothetical. This is something that they have been working towards for decades, really. They are trying to encircle and contain China. That is not a secret. They all but say that openly, publicly, and there are documents. So let's just take a look at some of this. And I've shown people this many, many times, and it's important to keep showing people this. This is from the U.S. State Department's official website, the Office of the Historian. And this is a memo dated 1965, and they openly say that the war with Vietnam, the U.S. war against Vietnam, only made sense if it was in support of a long-run United States policy to contain communist China. And down here it says there's three fronts: the Japan-Korea front. This is in 1965. Today, there's tens of thousands of troops in South Korea and Japan. The India-Pakistan front. We're going to talk about how the U.S. is involved in Pakistan backing separatists to attack the Belt and Road Initiative. And the Southeast Asia front. We're going to talk about Myanmar and how U.S.-backed opposition groups are attacking a pipeline that's part of China's Belt and Road Initiative going through Myanmar, and of course the Milk Tea Alliance. So this is in 1965, and they've been talking about this ever since. Angela, are there any key documents or things from the past that stick out in your mind that you really think are important to highlight this point?
Well, I recently came across a 2005 memorandum from the Navy that I shared this with you just before, and it's all talking about the blockade. You know, so here we have a new paper of 1965. It's related to the different fronts, but then so this is how they encircle China, And then there's one other technique is the blockade, because there are different ways that they are going to attack China. The most aggressive would be over Taiwan, a bit less aggressive, not more indirect, just to cripple Chinese economy, would just to do a blockade. So there are different ways to do blockades. And but the major point would be the Malacca Straits. The problem for China is that the Malacca Strait is actually far from Chinese army bases, so it would be very difficult to counter this blockade. And my opinion is that for China wouldn't go for necessarily for war if the US was to do a blockade. It might actually just bear higher shipping rates by going either inland to the Belt and Road Initiative, because it's a bit more expensive, or they would just bypass and do miles more of shipping route, just because they want to avoid war.
Yes, and that paper that you shared with me right before the show, that was the Naval War College put that together, and they just straight up say that they could do these blockades, they could do them near China, or they could do them further out, and they could cripple Chinese trade. And China's economy is built on trade. This is from 2016, war with China, and this was commissioned by the US military. They commissioned this study. And I just want to point out to people, and I know I've gone over this also, but I think it's really worth going over again and again and again. So here they say, let's get it a little bit bigger here. We postulate that a war would be regional and conventional, which means they don't think that it would go nuclear. And I'll explain that in a moment. A lot of people think war is impossible between the US and China because they both have nuclear weapons. I don't think that this is the case. It would be waged mainly by ships on and beneath the sea, by aircraft and missiles of many sorts in space, against satellites, and cyberspace, against computer systems. And they say, we assume the fighting would start and remain in East Asia, where potential Sino-US flashpoints and nearly all Chinese forces are located, because the US is right up to China's coast. Taiwan is right off of China's coast. The South China Sea is territory that China claims. So this is the US on the other side of the Pacific Ocean provoking this. And China's forces are in China. They admit that in the RAND Corporation paper, and that is still the case today. 2016, 2021, that is still the case. Let's go to the next part, which I think is really important. They're talking about, although war would harm both economies, damage to China's could be catastrophic and lasting, on the order of a 25 to 35% reduction in Chinese gross domestic product in a year-long war, compared with a reduction in US GDP on the order of 5 to 10%. Even a mild conflict, unless ended promptly, could weaken China's economy. A long and severe war could ravage China's economy, stall its hard-earned development, and cause widespread hardship and dislocation. This part is really important. Such economic damage could in turn aggravate political turmoil and embolden separatists in China. And Angela, you know who is backing all of these separatists and have been for decades. Which separatist groups come to mind when you read this in a RAND Corporation document commissioned by the U.S. Army?
Well, absolutely. The first that come to my mind is ETIM. So that's a terrorist group, and the worrying thing is that recently it was listed as a terrorist organization by the U.S. So it's clearly showing what is the goal here. By the listing ETIM, it allows anyone to fund this terrorist organization. Just reminding that they've done like multiple terrorist attacks in China and outside China, and they've been fighting in a Syrian war, and also there's still quite a lot of ETIM members in Afghanistan. So that's one of them. But remember, the US and the CIA has been funding early on, had been funding separatists in Tibet as well. So there's a long story. It's a repetition of having funding groups that are going to actually fight US wars. And here is more about disruption. When you disrupt China all around, from either by disrupting Chinese neighbors. Here I'm thinking about Myanmar, Thailand, Philippines. They've been trying to stir up problems there. And then you encircle China with army bases, and then there's Taiwan. So we're talking about multiple front here.
Yes, and let's just go to this Newsweek article. Exclusive, despite China's pressure on Taliban, Uyghur separatists see opportunity in Afghanistan. The reason the U.S. said they delisted the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, ETIM, is because they said it hadn't been active for over 10 years. And yet in this, and they did that in 2020. So if we go here, they say right here, for many years, the U.S. included ETIM on its terrorist exclusion list, part of the Patriot Act measures established after the 9/11 attacks. The Pentagon even targeted the group with airstrikes in Afghanistan up until at least 2018. So the U.S. is just lying about the reason they delisted them. And now this Newsweek article is from, I think it's from this month. So a representative from the ETIM did an interview with Newsweek, and they're just talking as if, oh, it's just this group that's out there and they don't like China. And they share the same aspirations the US has of containing China because it's a threat to, they even say it's a threat to everyone, everything on the face of the earth right here. The links to all of these articles are going to be in the video description below. So please read through these if you're interested, or if you're hearing this and you don't believe it, read it for yourself. So getting back to the Rand Corporation document, they're talking about not waging a war against China militarily and winning. They're not talking about defeating the Chinese military. They're talking about damaging its economy enough to cause internal turmoil. And this is something the US has done to many countries around the world where Angelo, you're in Venezuela. You see the US doing this to Venezuela right now, just grinding the economy into dust in hopes that it will cause enough upheaval that the government will collapse. This is what they have planned for China, not a military victory over the Chinese military, but to damage the economy enough to do this. Now, you're in Venezuela. You say you still need to do some research and traveling around, but I mean, can you talk a little bit about what the U.S. has done economically to Venezuela?
I will give you just some figures. The GDP has gone down by 80%. Imagine, Venezuela used to live on oil, and now because of the sanctions, they can barely produce their oil, and they actually have to import gasoline from Iran. Iran has been shipping quite a few tankers here, and actually 2 tankers were seized by the US. So it's just it's just piracy what they're doing. So here locals, they have to line up between, I mean, if it's a really good day, it's 3 hours just to get gasoline, but average days are 12 hours. So imagine the main activities of locals here in Venezuela is how do I get gasoline? So gasoline is gold here. But can you imagine, Venezuela has the largest oil reserve in the world. They're sitting on, it's so rich, there's gold, there's so much wealth here. So what is happening is actually sanctions are working. The last information I got, I've been talking to many people, and people are there's so much disillusion that actually they're willing just to make concessions. And this is what they're starting to do. So now there's an agreement with the IMF, and you know how it goes with the IMF. Whenever there's an agreement and they loan you money, there are conditions attached. So they're starting to actually bow to making concessions. And when we are talking about concession, it's about, giving up some of your sovereignty. So it's very sad. And sadly, I can see here, this is one of the cases where the sanctions are working because the economy is screaming and people are just desperate. People are living on a few dollars a day. It's just dramatic. And for me, I'm back after 20 years. I used to live here in Venezuela, and I see a Venezuela completely changed. There's people used to be happy. They used to dance, party, and people are sad. They're just struggling every day. People are hungry, and it's very sad, And this is what when it comes to China, the US would try to do that to China, make the economy scream, and they're very open about this. You know, it's about money. It's about, you know, crippling the Chinese economy, the same as they did, you know, the Opium War, this humiliation. They want to repeat the 100 years of humiliation.
Yes, and I want to show people this. This is from the Naval War College paper that you shared. Let's see. They talk about how China's economic progress is arguably the cornerstone of the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy. They know this. They know if they can cripple the economy, they can undermine and get rid of the government. This is their plan. And this is 2008, 2016 papers say that, and you hear politicians in the West saying this from behind podiums today. And so that's what they would do. They would use blockades. They would continue all of the other forms of economic sabotage that we've already seen them use during this trade war. And what they're going to do is keep pushing China towards that point of failure. And then at the same time, give them the opportunity to subordinate themselves to a Western-led, rules-based international order. This has been the dream of the US for decades. This is what they've wanted to do to China. They're upset because China is bigger, it's more powerful, and if the status quo is maintained and there is no conflict, there is no opportunity for the US to cripple China's economy, they will surpass the West. And they will determine things on their own terms. And why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't every nation be able to do that? So there's that. And then one more thing. It's on page 65. This is a long document. Let me share the screen. This is a long document. It's on page 65. And
Brian, may I add something?
Yes, sure.
May I add something? But I'm thinking here, I think it would be interesting just to draw some parallels with World War II. There are so many things that are similar to World War II, especially when it comes to the US and Japan. Remember what happened? How did it start with Japan? The US started, this US started to seize Japanese assets, and they started doing a blockade. And so basically it crippled Japanese economy because it didn't get any oil anymore because of the blockade. And so this what triggers the attack on Pearl Harbor. Another thing is that what would happen here is that the war would be on Asia. So the parallel would be the war that happened in Europe. Basically, it's not touching U.S. soil, and they're having other countries actually waging U.S. wars. What happened before the World War II? U.S. economy had 15% of world GDP, and after World War II, because of the Europe was completely destroyed, U.S. share of GDP, world share of GDP went up to 35%. So you see the parallel. It's about right now, the world economy, the largest share is in Asia. So it's not about crippling Chinese economy. I think it's a big mistake to see only China. I think it's about looking at the big picture. It's all Eurasia. There's a shift of gravity in terms of world economy towards Eurasia. It's about how we can actually cripple all these blocks. So when you're destroying those economies, you are building up a war machine. It's an economy of war, and actually, while the other countries are just busy waging the war that you instigated. You see, so it's the repetition of what happened in World War II. War was happening in Europe, now it's going to be in China, but not on US soil. You see, that's the problem. China actually can only defend its territory, but it cannot attack back US because US soil is just far, far away. And this is why it's so easy for the US to wage a war, because it knows that it can attack other countries, but it won't be attacked because it's impossible. There's too much distance for China to go all the way to US soil.
Yeah, and you just pointed out a very key point here. The US, you can see what they're doing. They're getting Australia in the firing line. They've got Japan and India as part of the Quad. They're in there in Southeast Asia trying to coerce these countries to pick a side, and if not, they'll destabilize them. So you can see how if there was a conflict, there would be so much opportunity there to just ruin the entire region. And just like you said, there's all these countries that are going to go into the grinder of war long before the US is even scratched by any conflict. And the Rand Corporation paper actually does explicitly say that China doesn't even have the conventional weapons to reach the US homeland. So they know this is a war that's, unless it goes nuclear, and they don't think that it would, they're not even going to get scratched in this. It's going to be their allies in Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific. It's going to be China and any country that is allied with it. Now, there's this part right here where they're talking about the shipping, because this is how the conflict will actually look like. It's not going to be the US invading mainland China. It's going to be at sea, and it's going to be done to deliberately threaten shipping lanes and compromise them, slow them down, or stop them altogether. And so they're saying, assuming that non-Chinese commercial enterprises would rather lose revenue than ships or planes, the United States would not need to use force to stop trade to and from China. China would lose a substantial amount of trade that would be required to transit the war zone. The United States explicitly threatening commercial shipping would be provocative, hazardous, and largely unnecessary. So they think the US wouldn't even really need to do a real blockade. They could do it through other means, just to threaten ships enough to convince them not to go into that region and not go to Chinese ports, go or come from Chinese ports. So this is the Rand Corporation talking about this. And again, this is US seizes Iranian fuel from 4 tankers bound for Venezuela. They did not seize these tankers by force. They used legal means. They used the threat of sanctions to do this. They say no military force was used in the seizure of the cargo, and none of the ships was physically impounded. Instead, US officials threatened ship owners, insurers, and captains with sanctions to force them to hand over their cargo. And I could see them doing this on a large scale to China. So it could be something centered around Taiwan. It could be this Uyghur human rights stunt that the US is in the middle of engineering. They could use that. There are a combination of factors where they could do something like this and hurt shipping to and from China. Now, let's see. We're talking about Chinese military might versus American military might. And people always talk about how the Chinese military is very large. And it is. And their Navy is very large. They actually have more ships than the US Navy, although the US Navy has more tonnage. In other words, the US may have slightly fewer ships, but their ships are larger and more significant. Aircraft, they have many more aircraft carriers than China does. Angelo, you're actually the one who sent me a lot of these articles about the spending. Is there any point that you want to make on that?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's very important to compare spending in terms of purchasing power parity. Just because there's difference in currency value. What happens is that if you were to calculate, to compare what the US and China spend in terms of this concept of purchasing power parity, we are talking about the level, China is at 80% of US levels when it comes to military spending. Additional to that, I think it's very important to take into account that Chinese spending is much more savvy, meaning that in the US there's lots of waste. Just give you the F-35. How much did it cost? This project that actually it's a completely failed project cost $1 trillion US. That would be unthinkable when it comes to China. I've been doing business with Chinese. They're very savvy. They're very smart when it comes to spending. So I would say that they are on equal terms when it comes to the level of spending, with the only difference that China is actually just as focused on protecting its own territory. There was no expansions. China has I think 1 or 2 army bases. One is in Djibouti in Africa, and it's more for UN peacekeeping. So the thing is that the problem is that China can defend itself, but it would be very difficult to fight back. There are long cruise missiles that can be shot, but the problem is that China has this problem that it cannot fight back. It's if the war was to happen in the next 10 years, China would be in a very difficult position. So just sadly, because it just has to defend itself, and it can be crippled, because the US can cut its strategic routes, maritime routes, and it's just way too early, because the Belt and Road Initiative is not yet you cannot shift bypass the Malacca Strait yet. It's so it's just way too early for China, and this is why this RAND document says that there's a window of opportunity which is going to be from 2015 to 2025. After that, waging a war against China would be just way too expensive in terms of human life, in terms of destruction of the US Navy. It would be very destructive. So now I think the most probably it should be about a blockade of the Malacca Straits. And I think the worst case scenario would be Taiwan declaring independence, but I really doubt. I mean, it would mean would be just a suicide for Taiwan. And again, China, I'm not expecting China to do what the other side is expecting them to do. The other side wants China to get into a war. China won't do that. I think he would bite his tongue. He would be like, okay, well, you know what? This time is on our side. That's the thing. Time is on the side of China. Every year that passes, we are going away from war. But that is this window of opportunity for the US that he wants to use. And this is why they've been speeding up this whole narrative, manufacturing consent all the time. You can see it in Western media. And it's about, can they get the momentum or not? And I think there's a key point. They need what we call a casus belli, a case for war. And what I'm afraid is that they might do what they've done it all over again, in the Tonkin, the Gulf of Tonkin, this false flag operation. It could happen in China with China the same. Like they could actually, destroy a ship, a U.S. ship themselves, and put the fault on China and start a war like this. And I think this is the biggest danger, is false flag operation. And they're expert at this. And they have the monopoly when it comes to narratives. When you are the only one that has your hands on social media, you control the brain of people, so that's the biggest risk.
All extremely important points. Actually, you touched on a lot of really good points there. I see some people saying if US will go down with her. And of course, this is why the US is rushing to decouple. We hear this word all the time, the economic decoupling between the US and China. This isn't just because the US wants to beat China economically. This is a lot like you need to cut your arm off, so you tie it off before you do the cutting so you don't bleed out and die. It's going to be ugly and messy, but you'll survive. This is the US. This is what they're thinking about right now. This is all being done in coordination with a lot of other things. So let's take a look at some of these other things that the US is already doing. So this is from Defense News. Here's the US Marine Corps' plan for sinking Chinese ships with drone missile launchers. And this was from 2020. And they're talking about how the US Marine Corps is going to get rid of all of their tanks. No more M1A1 main battle tanks. They're going to get rid of all of them. And they're going to pursue a very specific mission and a very specific theater against a single nation, China, in the Indo-Pacific region. And they're going to do these ship hunting missions. That was in 2020 when they announced that. They have now already completely decommissioned all of their tanks. And they are doing this now. They have reconfigured an entire branch of the US military to do exactly what Angela was talking about, shutting down straits, shutting down shipping, targeting vessels out on the seas. This is what the US has done. They have prepared to do this. And here's some articles. Angela, you sent this. So there's this one about, I think you sent these. This is about the pipeline going through Myanmar, and you can see here's the Strait of Malacca. Here's what would be like the Kra Canal, which hasn't been built yet, but they always talk about it. That would help bypass the Strait of Malacca. But this bypasses all of this right here, this pipeline going through Myanmar. And of course, we know that the US was trying to put a client regime into power in Myanmar, headed by Aung San Suu Kyi and her National League for Democracy. It was ousted from power in February of this year. And these militants that the US is backing in Myanmar right now, they have attacked that pipeline already. And we can go to this Irrawaddy, which is funded by the US government through the National Endowment for Democracy. Deadly attack on pipeline station spotlights China's high stakes. And Myanmar, if you read through this article, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about how if China keeps backing the military in Myanmar, or if China doesn't help get the US client regime back into power, they can say goodbye to their pipeline because these militants will destroy it. So there's that. And then there's this one. What's this? Gwadar route. This is the China-Pakistan economic corridor. And there's a port at Gwadar that allows China to send hydrocarbons from the Middle East through Pakistan to China. And they don't even have to go anywhere near this, where the US Navy has all of its forces concentrated. So you could see how China knows this is their vulnerability. You could see how the Belt and Road Initiative is trying to diversify away from those maritime routes. But what's going on near Gwadar Port? This has been going on since 2011. This is from 2011. The US openly backing separatists in Baluchistan, Pakistan, where Gwadar Port is located. And just this year, militants have killed Chinese engineers working on CPEC. They've also tried to kill the Chinese ambassador to Pakistan just this year. So this is going on in Pakistan and Myanmar, and of course, the Belt and Road Initiative passes through Xinjiang, and so that's why we have this Uyghur issue that the U.S. is obsessed with. Angela, you want to add anything to this the reality that China is vulnerable in its sea lanes and how it's diversified away from them, but how those are already under attack by proxy. The U.S. has armed proxies.
Yeah, I think it's important to look at what Belt and Road Initiative is all about. For China, if this Belt and Road Initiative becomes a success and reality, it's a checkmate, because China is going to kill many birds with one stone. To give you a few, the Belt and Road Initiative is a way to bypass the Malacca Strait. So once China can bypass this Malacca Strait, it cannot be attacked economically. So also it's very important to understand that the US economy is like a Ponzi scheme. As long as you start reinvesting your US dollar into the US economy by purchasing or actually buying US bond, you're actually fueling this economy, which is a Ponzi scheme, which is not sustainable. Why? Because the US is actually buying more than what it sells. And this is why you have this huge trade deficit. So the Belt and Road Initiative is for China a good way to recycle its US dollar trade surplus into tangible assets. Because if the China doesn't invest into tangible assets, it's just a toilet paper currency. Because the US needs something, it prints money, and it's not tangible. So China, what it's doing, it stopped actually to buy US bonds for a while now. And this is why it wants to reinvest into the Belt and Road Initiative. And another way is actually to help your neighbors. If you help your neighbors, you build roads, you are going to have more trades. So the excess capacity of China in terms of production will go to its neighbors, and it's actually shifting the gravity, the economic gravity of the world towards Eurasia. So this Belt and Road Initiative is a checkmate for China. And so you see, it's all about this hegemony. And plus, additional to that, there's the ultimate goal. I mean, not necessarily goal, because China doesn't necessarily want to attack, but by doing this, you can see there's a decoupling when it comes to the US dollar. Once the US loses the dollar hegemony, it will lose completely its power, because it can Now it has no limits to printing money and to purchasing, right? So if US was a closed economy and they would print money, well, you would have hyperinflation, would be not sustainable. So you see the end of the US dollar would mean the collapse of US economy. So the thing is that for China, it's about how you can have this transition, smooth, and maybe actually have a bailout of the US economy. They need to find some compromises on this, what we call the Thucydides trap. Remember, the Thucydides trap is all the cases in the world history where you had a upcoming power which is surpassing the others, and 14 cases out of 16 ended up in true war. At the end of the day, it's all about money and hegemony, and it's about a country like the US, which makes up for 4% of the world population, to accept that, we are heading towards a multipolar world. It's not sustainable. 4% of the world population, which is controlling the rest of the population. It is not possible. So are they mad? Are they mad to go to war? Or are they willing to accept that, this US exceptionalism is, it's just madness. It needs to accept that, there's a big world out there, and it could be multipolar, and with China and Russia emerging, maybe it might become like more democratic, and colonialism would finally end up, because you see, colonialism has never ended up. What we're having now with the US, it's modern colonialism, but it's with much better marketing. In the old days, they used to export civilization, and now they're exporting other things. But the end goal is just control. It's control. It's hegemony, and it's how you can keep the global South poor. It's all about this. Why the global South is so rich in resources and it has been kept poor? Because of colonialism, because it hasn't stopped.
Absolutely. And just to give people an idea of how far the US and its allies are willing to go, think about what happened at the end of the Cold War when the Soviet Union collapsed and this balance between East and West was tilted in favor of the West. And what did they do with that favorable balance? They embarked on the first war with Iraq, the Gulf War. And then the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, the invasion of Iraq in 2003. We watched them destroy Libya in 2011, Syria from 2011 onward, overthrowing the government of Ukraine in 2014, the mobs in Hong Kong, and now all across Southeast Asia. They have armed conflict in Myanmar right now, violent protests in the streets of Bangkok. They were trying to work on protests in Malaysia. We can see what they have done since the end of the Cold War, how many people they have killed, the swath of death and destruction they have created from North Africa, across the Middle East, through Central Asia, and all along China's peripheries. And people need to look into what was going on in Xinjiang before China enacted those security policies. There was basically... looks like we lost Angelo. Hopefully he'll reboot his connection and rejoin us. This happens again. We're doing this live. He is in Venezuela, and the connection is not so good there. So just keep in mind what the U.S. has done up until now, trying to establish its primacy over the world, and what it might do regarding China. To maintain this hegemony. They're not just going to allow China to surpass them without a fight. Now, people are asking about nuclear weapons. So let's take a look at nuclear weapons. There's no chance China will out-nuke the United States. And people can say, maybe China has more nuclear weapons than they're leading on to, but most people seem to think they have a couple hundred. Whereas the U.S. has thousands. They have something like over 3,000 and over 1,000 that are ready to be used. So first you have to think, what would get China to use nuclear weapons in the first place? or if the US decided to strike first, they have this overwhelming advantage with the sheer number of warheads that they could use. Just the whole idea of China coming out ahead or even evenly in an exchange with the US is just unlikely. The use of nuclear weapons is highly unlikely. Even if China was their trade was being blocked, there was a blockade or a semi-blockade, if there were sanctions, if there was all of this subversion, they're not going to do a nuclear strike on the US. It's just very unlikely that they would do this. And I just kind of want to point something out. Let's see if I can find it. Yes, this right here. Do we remember when Russia intervened in Syria on behalf of the Syrian government against the terrorists that the US was sponsoring, arming and sponsoring, and Turkey shot down one of their jets? And a lot of people said this was suicide for Turkey. They shot down this jet. Russia is a nuclear-armed global power. There's going to be massive retaliation, and there really wasn't. There really wasn't, because Russia knew that a disproportionate response to this was not going to serve them well in the long term. And so this is why they didn't do it. They know that the best way to get revenge against the interests in Turkey responsible for this is to just stay patient, stay focused on winning the war in Syria and foiling the plans of the United States and its regional allies. And I think China is probably going to do something very similar in this regard. If there was any conflict that broke out, I don't think they would overreact and use nuclear weapons. We have to try to be realistic. And people have to remember, I'm not saying these things about a possible conflict between the US and China because I want to see it happen. I don't want to see it happen. I want people to be aware of how serious this is, how vulnerable China still is right now at this moment. 2025, 2030 onward, not so vulnerable, and things will look a lot more promising. But right now, there's still this window of opportunity the US has. I want to warn people about this. I want people to be aware of it. I want them to spread the word about this because the more people talking about this, the more people showing how the US is seeking to do this to China and why, and how unwarranted it is, and how it's just another unjustified war that they're trying to get everybody to go along with, the harder it will be for the US to pull the trigger on something like this. Now, I just want to show one more thing. When I talk about the US backing separatists in Baluchistan, I really mean it. This is a House resolution at the US Congress from 2012 expressing the sense of Congress that the people of Baluchistan, currently divided between Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan, have the right to self-determination and to their own sovereign country. If Baluchistan declared itself independence, it would cut the Belt and Road Initiative corridor going through Pakistan permanently, and China would lose that. And that was the whole reason they were doing that, and they're still doing it right now. They're doing something similar in Myanmar, and they're trying to do something similar in Xinjiang. They're backing violent separatists specifically to do this. So let me see if I can see what happened with Angelo. Just a moment. He's having problems with his connections. Again, what's happening to Venezuela, where Angelo is currently based in, I mean, this is what they seek to do to all countries that they have these issues with. So Iran, Syria, Yemen, and they're trying to do this to China as well. So while we wait for Angela to come back, we're almost at the 45-minute mark. Let's start doing questions and answers. So just put a Q in front of your question, and let's try to do some of these questions. So let's see. Let me go up. I saw a couple here. So a question: if China does not have enough nukes to serve as a sufficient mutually assured destruction deterrent, against conventional war, couldn't it simply build more to the levels of Russia and the US? I mean, it could do that, but even if you had enough weapons, enough nuclear weapons, is that really a deterrent against conventional war? If the US does not invade the Chinese mainland or strike targets in the Chinese mainland, if they're just blockading ships, is that enough reason for China to use nuclear weapons? And the answer is no, and the US knows that. And until China has the conventional military means to protect its shipping lanes, or until the Belt and Road Initiative is developed enough where they don't need those shipping lanes, they could diversify away from them, this is going to be a threat that China has to face. And I don't think any number of nuclear weapons is going to compensate for that. How does Russia figure into US-China conflict? I mean, look at how Russia is handling Syria, or how Russia is handling what the US is doing to Iran or Venezuela. There's only so much Russia can do. I think a lot of people overestimate their ability. Some people say, why didn't Russia save Libya? It's because they just don't have the sea lift or airlift power to send a significant military force that far, operate there, and turn the tide in that conflict. They gambled in Syria and they came out on top, but you could see that the military footprint of Russia in Syria is so much smaller than anything that the US has ever done. It's because their capabilities are limited, and China's capabilities are limited. People look at the Chinese military on paper and they say they've got this number of troops, this number of ships, but you have to remember logistics. The Chinese Navy does not really have the capability to operate globally. They are able to operate along China's peripheries, but as far as going beyond that, a so-called blue water navy, they need to develop their logistics. They need to develop relationships with other countries so they can use their ports to replenish and repair their ships. And these are things that the US already has well developed. Airlift capability. We saw the C-17s the US was using to evacuate from Afghanistan. They have something like over 200 C-17s alone, and then they have many other cargo airlift capable jets. China has 20, something like 20 jets that are comparable to the C-17. So you can see the disparity here. Let's see. Let's get some more questions. Let me see how. Looks like we might have lost Angelo. Well, we'll just keep an eye out for him. All right. Let's see some more questions. Let's see. Just scroll up here. Could Russia and China form an alliance? Well, I think they are kind of doing that. You know, they're doing that in terms of economics. They're doing it militarily. But again, there's limitations to what that can achieve at this moment. Now, 10 years from now, as this relationship matures, as trade routes are developed, you know, rail line going from China through Russia to Europe and everywhere in between, when that's fully developed, then that will turn the tide. That will serve as a deterrent. The US there won't even be a reason for them to try to do this. The reason they're doing this now is because the window is closing. They have a chance to use their military force before their advantage is diminished. Wouldn't the problem be solved if Taiwan and ASEAN comes out and tells the US that they don't want any war in their backyard? War will affect all countries, including Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea. That's actually a good question. You saw the Quad alliance between Australia, the US, Japan, and India, and you could see how India and Japan are very reluctant partners. This is why they had AUKUS, because right now they've got a government in Australia who's very eager to sabotage itself economically and in the short and long term, and the UK that has just followed the US in every war of the 21st century and before that as well. So AUKUS is put together specifically because nations in the region nations that neighbor or are close by China don't want a conflict with China. They know they don't benefit from it. But Taiwan right now, people have to understand there's two political factions in Taiwan. There's one that wants to maintain the status quo, and if the status quo is maintained in Taiwan, eventually it will be reincorporated into the mainland economically, socially, economically, politically, kind of like Hong Kong. But the Democratic Progressive Party that is in power right now, this is backed by the US, and just like the Australian government, they are making decisions that are not in the best interest of Taiwan in the short or long term. And they are leading Taiwan down a path to its own ruins, because just like with Australia, they're doing this on behalf of Washington, not on behalf of their own best interests. So that this is what complicates it. I'm sure of the... Why is China okay? So World Health Organization. I mean, I guess there's a lot of. Let's see. Let's find another. Yeah, I mean, here's another one. Does Japan or Korea, as protectorates of the United States, have the ability to say no to the U.S. in its confrontation with China? I mean, if you look at trade between South Korea and China, or Japan and China, I mean, China is a very significant trade partner. Everyone on both sides is benefiting from this relationship. They will not benefit from a conflict, and they know that. So this is always the problem. South Korea and Japan have little choice when there's tens of thousands of US troops stationed in their territory. And think about South Korea. They brought in those THAAD missile systems. They say this is to protect South Korea from missiles launched by North Korea. When has North Korea launched missiles into South Korea since the armistice? So never. So those are there. So when the US provokes a war with China, the US can protect its bases in South Korea and Japan. And as a matter of fact, in that RAND Corporation document, they do talk about how it would be great if China struck those bases and there was collateral damage, because then it would make it easier to push South Korea and Japan into a war that they otherwise wouldn't want to be in. Okay, maybe this one. How would ASEAN react to a US-initiated war? I'm not sure that there's much that they could. I don't think there's much they could do. Right now, the US is instigating political instability all across ASEAN. The reason and when you look at these opposition groups, like the opposition group here in Thailand, they're very anti-Chinese. As a matter of fact, where is this one? Let's share the screen. Milk Tea Alliance. Twitter creates emoji for pro-democracy activists. And this is all of the fake opposition groups operating across Southeast Asia. They all have joined this Milk Tea Alliance, along with the independence movement in Taiwan and the violent mobs in Hong Kong. And it says right here, the alliance has brought together anti-Beijing protesters in Hong Kong and Taiwan with pro-democracy campaigners in Thailand and Myanmar. What do they all have in common? The National Endowment for Democracy funds all of them, and they all hate China, and that's it. And why is the U.S. creating the Milk Tea Alliance, this alliance of street mobs? Because none of the governments in the region want conflict with China. None of them will join the U.S. crusade against China. They are benefiting from their relationship with China, and so they have created this opposition to undermine these countries, to undermine the governments, if possible, replace them with a US client regime that will cut ties with China. And failing that, just destabilize these countries enough to where China really cannot have a constructive relationship with them, because they are teetering towards a failed state, like Myanmar is right now. Maybe a couple of more questions, and then maybe we can wrap this up. Let me see if Angelo's connection has crashed. Again, Angelo is He's in Venezuela right now. I am based in Bangkok, Thailand. So we're on opposite ends of the planet. It's kind of amazing that we're able to do this at all. But his connection there is really touch and go. All right, let's look for some more questions here. Okay, so Taipei had good cooperation with Beijing under the previous government. What happened? The Sunflower Revolution happened. So it was another US-sponsored color revolution. They barricaded themselves inside the halls of the government there in Taiwan. And this is eventually what led to the Democratic Progressive Party getting into power. They did to Taiwan what they're doing to Australia and all the countries in Southeast Asia. They're trying to install these anti-Beijing governments to just create chaos across the entire region. Let's do this real quick, because this will be very telling. This is an excellent tool that I'm going to show you. The Atlas of Economic Complexity from Harvard University. Let's look at Taiwan's trade by partner. Where did Taiwan export to in 2019? If you take China and Hong Kong and add them together, because it's both China, look how significant of an export market mainland and Hong Kong are for Taiwan versus North America, Europe, and everywhere else combined. Mainland China alone is a larger export market. And let's look at imports. Still, China is their number one import, the importer. So what does this tell you? This tells you economically, Taiwan's best interests are tied to the mainland. And so you have a government in power right now in Taiwan who is making decisions that completely jeopardize this essential aspect of Taiwan's economic health. And so why would you do that? You would do that because you're not actually the real representative of the people of Taiwan. You represent interests in Washington, and the current government in Taiwan, that is what they're doing. Why doesn't Japan assert its independence from the United States? Well, I mean, this is because they lost World War II. The US really made sure that their economy was kind of captured, their institutions semi-captured by the US, plus they have tens of thousands of US troops sitting in Japan. So, I mean, this is a huge problem that Japan would have to undo all of these things that were put in place after World War II before they could even think about doing that. But again, economically, the status quo, eventually the US is going to lose its foothold there. It's happening in the Philippines, slowly but surely, in South Korea, and everywhere else. So, I mean, this is why the US would be tempted to instigate a limited conventional conflict with China at sea, not attacking the mainland necessarily, to disrupt trade and to knock China's economy down a peg, to give the US another decade or decades of primacy over the Indo-Pacific region and over the world. And like we were talking together with Angelo about, the US wants to subordinate China in this international order of theirs. And so a limited conflict disrupting Chinese trade, crippling the economy, stirring up trouble within China socio-politically, and then giving them an out, subordinating themselves under the US, under the West. This is what they're going to try to do. So I think that does it for this episode of Inflection. Unfortunately, Angela wasn't able to rejoin us. Everyone, thank you for tuning in. I think we're going to try to do this live every week if we can. We'll see what we can do about Angelo's connection. Thank you for joining. Check the video description for all the links that we talked about. And until next week, bye for now.